Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories. An extra-long episode of Dogman fighting stories. Dogman fights a polar bear. Dogman fights a Bigfoot. Dogman fights... I don't know. Is that some kind of a pig, perhaps? Well, Dogman fights it later in this very episode. But first, we are required to present this public service announcement about the rules of Halloween.
If you were a kid in the USA, you got lectured and they would say, good kids shouldn't be heard, just seen, and they teach you the rules of Halloween. There was one thing that mom forbade, eating chocolate with razor blades. Don't eat the candy if it's got razors in it. Just follow down the spicy facts from the beginning. Be careful, candy, make sure it's clean. Don't eat razors, the rules of Halloween.
Dogman, battles, polar bear. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a story for you that took place in the very late 1960s. I had been drafted along with a buddy of mine I'll call Lyle, and we talked each other into fleeing to Canada. Neither of us knew anybody up there, but we didn't want to end up in body bags, so we ran. I've had many conversations with people who felt that what we did was wrong, just as I've had many discussions with those who felt that what we did was justified. All I know is what I knew then. I wanted to survive, and I don't trust the government to be on my side. That's any government, any of them. Even if I had known that we would have been confronted with the Dogman, I can't imagine that I would have made any other choice. Most people who encounter the Dogman survive, as far as we know at least. I guess nobody really knows for sure. Lyle and I tried to settle down up in Canada a few times, but the places that didn't make me paranoid made him paranoid, so we kept going further and further north until we found ourselves staying in a remote cabin in northern Ontario in the vicinity of a place called Otter Rapids. If you're wondering what it's like in and around Otter Rapids, the answer is, it's cold and snowy, and you get snowed in pretty easily, so you better keep food and supplies on hand, and you better keep your vehicle in the best condition you can, so that when the roads are cleared, you can go get more food and supplies. Sometimes it gets too cold to drive, and that was something that we had to learn the hard way. We were driving back home to our hovel, loaded with food and other necessities one night, when our car just stopped working, and we puttered to a stop alongside a wall of snow 7 feet tall, plowed on either side of the road. We got out, looked under the hood, experimented with a few different things, then realized the car was just not going to start. I thought we should try to walk back home, but Lyle reminded me of two things. One, we had more food in the car than at home, and two, if we tried walking back through the night, we might freeze before we got there. I asked him what he thought we should do, and he pointed out that the sun should be coming up in about another 4 hours, so he thought we should keep ourselves warm in the car and wait it out. The car might start in the morning once things warmed up a bit. If not, surely someone would have driven past us by then. Even if they couldn't help us, we could send word along with them to send out a tow truck or some other means of rescue. He was right. By the morning, there should be at least a little traffic. We just had to survive the night, keeping each other warm, and having ourselves a little picnic in the meantime. That sounded good to me. At some point during the night, Lyle woke me up and asked me what that sound was. I listened, and I could definitely hear what he was talking about. I had no idea what it was either. There was a muffled sort of tumbling sound, and you could feel the car bouncing or shaking slightly from it every so often. To me, it sounded like some kind of machinery rolling in the snow, but Lyle pointed out that machines repeat the same sounds over and over. This sound kept changing. While we were discussing it, some kinds of very animalistic noises erupted in the middle of the muffled, tumbling sounds. Both of us ducked down instinctively, and if I looked half as dumb as Lyle did, then I looked pretty stupid right then. I wanted to get out and look around, but then again, I didn't want to do anything of the kind. You have to remember that from inside the car, we could look forward and back, but there were tall white walls of snow to our left and right. We both surmised that whatever was happening up on top of one of those snowbanks, either the left one or the right one. Since the left one was a little further away, I tried my best to get a view over the top of it by moving my head as far up as I could go inside the car. I really didn't see very far over there, though, so the effort was pointless. That didn't stop me from trying, though, since it was basically the only thing I could do in that situation without getting out of the vehicle. As I was pushing my head up into the car roof so hard it hurt, something crashed and rolled off the closer snowbank to the right, then landed hard on top of the car. This, for me, was like being punched in the brain, so I got knocked silly, and I was down for the count briefly. When I woke up, I had the headache of all headaches. When I strained to get myself up in a sitting position, I noticed Lyle staring wide-eyed out the left windows with a look of horror on his face as he was backed all the way up toward the right side of the car. Looking where he was looking, I saw a big, yellowish-white, hairy monster, and I screamed. I genuinely thought I was looking at an abominable snowman. That's what I thought I was seeing. I could not tell if I was looking at the front or the back of it. I just saw fur pressed up against the windows on that side, and I felt the car rocking. Was the Yeti trying to push the car into the snowdrift? Talk about waking up to a confusing and shocking scene. I was really struggling to make even the slightest bit of sense out of anything, and Lyle seemed too far gone to try asking anything of. Then, the yellowish-white wall of fur moved away from the windows, and I could soon see that I was looking at the back of the creature. And then, past the light-colored fur, I saw dark gray fur moving independently. In other words, there were at least two big animals out there, and they seemed to have fallen off of the snowbank onto the car, and then onto the plowed snowy highway. The Yeti dove onto the other creature, and the two rolled on the street, each attempting to bite, rip, and tear the other one to pieces. It was then that, for the first time, I could see that the Yeti was in fact a polar bear. I knew there were some polar bears in captivity or sanctuaries around there, so I assumed it had escaped. You see, I had thought that polar bears didn't come that far south, but I've had decades since then to look into it, and it turns out that Otter Rapids is considered part of the southern edge of the polar bear's turf. So most likely that bear was not an escapee. It was more likely an actual wild polar bear that had for some reason strayed from his clan. However it got there, it was a giant beast, and as fast-moving and savage as it was immense. It swung its arms in wide arcs, seeming to be landing many blows on its opponent, which it was also constantly attempting to bite. Both creatures were covered in snow at that point, which was flying everywhere as they scuffled and rolled all over the snowy highway. The other creature did something to the bear that caused it to howl in pain and to rear up on its hind legs, crashing backward into our car all over again. This time, it was only obscuring the rear window, and I got my first decent view of what he had been fighting. It was a dog. Or a wolf, but a giant one. A massive, impossibly huge dog. that rose to all fours in a threatening manner, its claws digging deep in the snow as it bared its prehistoric, caveman-looking fangs and gums to frighten that polar bear. I don't know if it succeeded, but I know I wet myself upon sight of that grimacing monster mouth. The big wolf dog leaped through the air, landing with its claws in the upright bear's shoulders and digging its long fangs into the opponent's neck. It turned out, when it was on its hind legs, it was even taller than the polar bear. The enraged bear threw the dog backward. The wolf backed off a few steps on his hind legs, but he never dropped back down to all fours. He advanced again like a boxer, like a human being in other words. It looked surprisingly steady on its hind legs, and I couldn't believe what was happening. An idea occurred to me to try the car engine again, even though the sun was still at least 2 hours away. The only thing that seemed to be happening was I was making the car whine, and I was probably going to flood the engine. I was about to give up and stop when the upright walking giant wolf slammed his paw, which looked shockingly large and hand-like, into the driver's side window, cracking it. It then slammed the side view mirror, knocking it out of place and almost tearing it off the car door. I backed out of the driver's seat, but I had gotten that wolf thing's attention, and now he was more interested in me than in the polar bear. He walked around the front of the car and started slamming his hand-like paws down on the car's front hood, loudly and violently. I was freaking out, and I turned around to see if Lyle was over his state of shock yet. He was not. But while turned around, I looked out the back, and I noticed the polar bear sniffing at our trunk, or boot, as they say across the pond. We had a lot of food in that trunk, and I think the polar bear had smelled it, because it seemed to be trying to figure out a way to open that trunk up somehow. "Duck down," came a weak voice out of nowhere. Lyle was coming back to his senses, and he was telling me to duck down. I hid myself as well as I could under the glove compartment, and after a while, that seemed to calm the angry Dogman down a bit. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say. I think it forgot why it was slamming on the hood, and its attention went back to the polar bear, who I was getting nervous might actually get into that trunk. Soon, the two of them were making terrible noises at each other all over again, and it looked like they were about to return to rumbling in the snow. An odd observation about the Dogman. When it would threaten the bear, it would go down on all fours like it was going to jump up on that bear. The polar bear, on the other hand, would rise up bipedally and roar down at the dog, holding its massive paws out in front of it, or else over its head. In other words, the polar bear tried to make itself seem as tall as possible, as it wanted to frighten off the Dogman, whereas the Dogman seemed to feel that getting down and threatening to jump up was the most frightening thing that it could do to intimidate the polar bear. I don't know what that means, or if it even means anything at all, but it's something very specific that I remember about the two of them and how they fought each other. The two hairy monsters started banging each other into the car all over again. This time, I felt like I was going completely insane, and I became furious. I leaned over and beeped the car horn, which made both the creatures stop fighting and leap about 2 feet straight up in the air in fright. That gave me a feeling or a sense of power for the first time since this had all started. When they came back down, I confidently beeped again, hoping it would scare the creatures off. Used to the loud sound, all the second beep had achieved was to focus the attention of both animals on me instead of on each other. Meekly, I slid back down and hid under the glove compartment again, and both hairy demons forgot about me and resumed fighting with each other. This all went on for longer than I care to remember. I was hidden and getting cramped in every muscle I had, but I could only make out tiny snippets of the action from my secreted position down where I was. I'm not sure how long I endured this situation, but it was certainly longer than I could endure it if I were back there today. A young man can put up with far more than an old one, obviously. Speaking of old man, I was thinking of how my old man would be laughing so hard if he could see me trapped the way I was. When I left home to go into hiding in Canada, he told me that God would make me pay for my cowardice. The only reason he hadn't called the authorities on me was my weeping mother begging him to let me go. Thinking of my mother got me even more upset because I began to honestly believe that I would never see her again. I thought I had accepted that possibility when I moved north, but I don't think it had really sunk in until that very moment. I forced myself to block out all emotions and memories, though, because the present moment was already overwhelming enough. I didn't need to add guilt and remorse on top of it all. It was around that point when I heard the sound of something approaching from outside. I mean, something on wheels. A vehicle. Sure enough, when I peeked over the dashboard this time, I saw a van driving in our direction. A VW van, I think, but don't quote me on that. Believe me, that was the most exciting thing in the world to me in that moment. I felt a new ray of hope that we might be getting rescued, and this nightmare might be coming to a close. I also saw that the dawn had begun, and the night was ending. I sat up and waved my arms, but doubted the driver would see me. I looked over to see the situation with the two giant manimals, and my gaze fell upon the fight, just in time to see the bear collapse from exhaustion, and probably blood loss as well. That was when that van started beeping their horn. I think they were beeping at the Dogman and the bear like they wanted them to get out of the way. That van didn't seem to have any desire to help Lyle and me out in our predicament. They only wanted to get where they were going. My heart sank, and I felt rage for whoever was driving that thing. The Dogman did too, as it ran toward the van, barking and completely flipping out in their direction. It was like he was saying, "I've had enough of you humans and your car horns. Beep beep my canine butt, all right?" He slammed his hands. Let's face it, they were more like hands than like paws, and he slammed them on that van's windshield. I saw little spiderweb cracks appear in the glass. With one blow, he did that to a windshield. Think about that for a second. After battling a freaking polar bear for literally hours, this 8 or 9 foot tall monster man had enough energy left over to crack the van's windshield. Can you even imagine such a thing? I saw it with my own eyes and I was like, wow, dude. I was more blown away by that than anything I ever saw in my life. Anything. He was so strong. He was like stronger than the laws of physics should have allowed him to be. The van put itself in reverse and started backing up out of there. It looked stupid, like some kind of scene from Benny Hill. I could even imagine the dumb Benny Hill music playing as that van skidded backwards and the Dogman advanced, barking like he had rabies or something. That van got far enough away from the Dogman to attempt to turn around, but the Dogman took advantage of that slowdown to run at the van and begin beating on the side of it. I saw the creature leave a big dent in the side of that thing. He was as strong as an elephant. It was truly breathtaking and terrifying at the same time. When the beat-up van succeeded in turning all the way around, it sped out of there so fast that it hydroplaned all over the snowy highway, skidding sideways into one wall of snow, then into the other one, until it eventually got under enough control to outpace the furious beast man and get away. I would have laughed if that weren't my one hope of escape being turned into comedy relief by the dog-headed ape man. The Dogman was so angry that he stood there, heaving air into and out of his lungs, watching the van disappear from sight. His breath was creating almost a cloud of steam around his head. His chest would expand and his shoulders would rise. Then he would breathe out and his shoulders would go back down. He was made of nothing but muscle, hair, and things that could slice you apart. I marveled at his physique, wondering as I looked at him if such a creature could even possibly exist. The Dogman turned around to begin walking toward us, and I banged my chin getting back down under the dashboard as fast as I could. I bit my tongue in the process. It was extremely painful, but I couldn't do anything but make myself small and try not to think about the excruciating pain. Well, the werewolf-like creature returned to his defeated polar bear opponent, and he tossed the bear over his shoulder like he was carrying a bag of dirty clothes to the laundromat. Then he lifted the creature up on top of the snowbank, and he climbed up there himself. I was wondering if he would drag the bear across the snow or lift him up again when Lyle said, "Try the engine," and scared me so badly that I jumped up and banged myself again. "Try the engine, man," he repeated. "The sun is up. Try the engine." I did as commanded and was shocked when the thing actually turned over. I then climbed painfully up into the driver's seat so that I could actually drive. I really hadn't expected it to work, so I had turned the key while still scrunched down on the car floor. I have no idea and no memory about what happened between then and taking a lot of aspirin back at the house. I was in severe pain all over. Plus, it's been over 50 years since this happened. Obviously, it could have turned out much worse than it did, and I'm grateful that I lived to tell the tale. After all, this story could have been called Dogman Eats My Butt, instead of being called Dogman Battles Polar Bear. Savage Dogman / cryptid battle in New Mexico. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've been following your channel for a while, sort of randomly. I'm hiding my identity under the Witness Protection Program, and although they gave me a cover job, I've been working from home during COVID, and I have a lot of free time. I can't remember how I first heard your show, but YouTube must have suggested it to me. I've been wrestling with the idea of telling you about my Dogman experience ever since that first day. I spoke with some people about it, and they urged me not to tell you because it might identify who I really was. At first I decided they were right, but after some time, I went back to them and said, who cares if it identifies who I was? I'm not that guy any longer. They still thought it was a bad idea because my situation involves a very important family in New Mexico, a family too entrenched to be taken down, even by the feds. After a while, they agreed that if I changed some details about what happened, and if I asked you to say it was intended for entertainment purposes only, then maybe I could tell you the story. So, the following narrative is for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real individuals, either alive or dead, will get me murdered, okay? So, this story began when I married this girl that I had only met a week earlier. I can't get too much into that, but I will say I was sincere about my intentions. I really hoped we would have a long and happy marriage, and I really thought that I loved her. I had no idea she was from a family that rich and powerful, but the family themselves did not believe that in the least. They thought I was out to rob them or something, so they used their influence to have the marriage annulled, and then they had some very nice gentlemen rough me up quite thoroughly and drive me out into the middle of nowhere on a very hot day and dump me. I was left for dead, essentially. I was too messed up from the lesson that the large gentlemen had taught me with their fists to even maintain consciousness for most of the day. And by nightfall, I was extremely dehydrated. I figured I was a goner, but I located a cactus and I derived some moisture from that. I've had some experience with that sort of thing in the past, but I can't explain any of that further. So, it was night, in the wilderness, in what turned out to be New Mexico, and I was in very bad shape. I knew I'd better search for shelter that night and get under some cover before the sun came up again, or I was not going to survive a second day. I saw a small grayish animal that looked like a pig. It had a giant head and a tiny body, and to me it looked like a cartoon or a toy. I decided to have it for dinner, as I was starved. I didn't understand how weakened I had become until I tried to throw a stone at the head of this little peccary thing, and my throw fell well short. Not short enough that I didn't annoy the little pig thing, which I later figured out was a javelina. I didn't know where I was or what a javelina was back then, but I know now. They may look cute and cuddly, but they have a really bad temper. After I threw that rock, the little javelina decided to give me a hard time, and he charged at me. I managed to dodge him, and then I apologized profusely and backed off. I was walking away, and I guess he didn't understand my apology because he made another run at me. I don't suppose I was retreating fast enough for his taste. I couldn't really go much faster, though, so I just limped along, keeping an eye on this one lone little critter who hated my guts. I can't blame him. I was trying to make dinner out of him after all. The area those men left me in was so devoid of anything but sand, rock, scrub brush, and a very occasional cactus that I didn't really know which direction I should be walking in. Almost like walking on the moon or something. I thought I was in Death Valley, but it turns out, like I said, I was in New Mexico, although I'm not sure where. The javelina was basically my cranky new friend, following along as though he had nothing at all to do, occasionally making a charge at my ankles. He had managed to land a few good shots on each foot, and it was getting harder and harder to walk. After some length of time, I noticed what looked like a telephone pole in the distance, and I decided to head for that. Maybe the pole was by a road. Maybe I could find someone to pick me up. As I got closer and closer to the telephone pole, I noticed a van parked there like the van from Scooby-Doo, but just plain white. When I finally arrived, I found it abandoned and empty. There was no key in the engine, but the vehicle seemed so rusted that I doubted it would have started anyway. I climbed inside and succeeded in getting the old side door unstuck, and then I got it mostly closed. There was a little space left that let air into the sweltering van interior, which was completely bare. It was too small an opening for my javelina friend to climb in, though. Even at night, the bare metal of the interior back was hot to the touch. I climbed up into the passenger seat, which was leather, but had been cut up a long time earlier. That exposed the foam seat interior, which was somewhat cooler to rest my aching body on. I sat there for a while watching the javelina circle me angrily, looking for a way to get in at me. He eventually decided that was impossible and walked off away from me to my front left. It was around midnight, and I had succeeded in finding shelter, if not water and food. At least that peccary couldn't peck at me any longer, so I allowed exhaustion to overtake me, and I fell asleep in that front seat. My ex-wife was crying in my dream, and I was apologizing to her. She thought I was passed away and that it was her fault. I was trying to tell her that I was still alive, but she couldn't hear me. It was like I was a ghost, and it was very frustrating. Suddenly, there was a loud banging to my right. I remember looking to my right in my dream, but there was nothing there. I didn't understand what had made that thudding sound. But then, bam! There it was again, this time shaking the van and waking me up. Still half asleep, I looked out the van windows and the entire vehicle was surrounded by javelinas. There were ones the size of my tormentor. There were larger ones. There were smaller ones. And they were all glaring at me in the night. And then, bam! The van got shaken from my right again. and this time I saw what was doing it. There was a peccary slamming its rock-hard hooves, or whatever they are, into the side of the van. He was not like the other javelinas, however. This was more like a peccary man than an ordinary little pig beast. It was as tall as I am, and I'm 6'2". I don't mean it was 6 foot tall at the shoulder. I mean this peccary was running around on his back legs like a man. Again, with his giant-sized head and his smaller body, it was like being attacked by Elmer Fudd or something. You wanted to call him cute, but his tusks, too large to fit in his mouth, told you that this was not a funny cartoon character. This was some kind of a cryptid version of a javelina. I mean, he was sort of the Bigfoot of all javelinas. Since he seemed to be part of their tribe, maybe he was some sort of mutation. If he was another species, then I don't know why he looked the same as the ordinary-sized peccaries. He just looked giant-sized and bipedal, but he had the same kind of pig face and bristly fur and dangerous-looking hooves as the others. I know some of you are going to say I was still dreaming, and I was hoping that was the explanation myself. I kept rubbing my eyes and blinking, but when I would open them, he was still there. And then, baroom, he would charge like a football player into the side of the van again. Bouncing off, he'd regain balance, trot a few more feet away, then put his head down and charge the rusty old van all over again. I turned around to look at the side door in the back. He seemed to be denting it, but by doing that, he had wedged it into the position it was in. I was not going to be able to get out that way, certainly. I hoped the front doors weren't too rusty to open, assuming those peccaries ever left me alone so that I could get out again. So, if you thought I was delirious and dreaming about the peccary man, you'll definitely think I dreamed this next part. In fact, I still can't believe this next part myself. Now remember, I had the giant pig thing trying to break into the van behind me and on the right. I had normal-sized peccaries out front, and probably around the back as well, as far as I knew. They were all staring at me with hunger in their eyes, like they were licking their lips or something. I felt like a human hamburger waiting to be eaten. Although I was parked on a road, I hadn't heard or saw one car in that entire time. Out in the desert and wastelands as dusty as this one, you can see a car traveling miles away because of the dust it kicks up and the dust trailing behind it. I had seen nothing of that sort in all this time. I was feeling pretty hopeless, and I had been on an extreme bad luck streak, obviously, so I guess I was just hoping that something good might happen sooner or later. I had no plan. I had zero ideas. I was thirsty, and I was tired. I remember thinking something like, "Please, God, make something happen." I meant something useful or helpful, but I distinctly remember thinking that exact thought. Then, suddenly, shockingly, something bigger than a man leaped into view from my left, trying to grab up peccaries on the street right in front of the van. And I swear to you, it was a freaking werewolf-looking animal man. He was so covered in fur that he must have been hotter than I was. I screamed a raspy scream, making myself cough in the process, and I rose to move back to the middle of the van. That's how frightened and surprised I was by the sudden appearance of this thing. Now, it didn't make sense to me in a few different ways. As much as I tried to remember what had been over there where the Dogman emerged from, all my mind's eye remembered seeing was more scrubland. Just desert with a bush here and there. No buildings, no caves, no mountains, no trees. Nothing that a creature as large as that big Dogman could have been hiding behind. Yet, when he pounced on those peccaries, they were just as surprised as I was. Some of them ran away. Others of them charged the beast man, same as my tormentor had been charging me in the beginning of this story. I saw the Dogman trying to grab them as they ran toward him, and some would skid away, turning at the last second to avoid capture. They looked like tiny bulls charging a giant matador, if that makes any sense. The Dogman had hands bigger than an outfielder's baseball glove, with long, sharp, talon-like claws at the ends of each finger. I couldn't understand how he could miss those little pig monsters, but it's a testament to their sheer agility and power that he did. I was so fascinated with what I was watching out the front windshield that I hadn't noticed that the thudding coming from my right side had ceased. But then, the giant javelina man charged out from the side of the van into full view in front, and I thought that was going to be all she wrote for that dog-headed man-thing. He was being swarmed by the normal-sized peccaries, and now on top of that, he was going to have to battle a creature almost his own size. The peccary man scored first, charging into the Dogman with his outstretched hooves, running into the canine cryptid so hard it knocked him backward, nearly causing him to slam into the dirt road. At the last second, he regained his balance and righted himself in a remarkably athletic maneuver. The creature caught himself by leaning back on one of his absurdly long arms, then using his massive hand to repel himself back to a fully upright position. Then he fell onto his other arm, lifting his feet off the ground and spinning in a circle, using that arm to rest his weight on. In the process, he managed to launch a two-footed kick to the peccary man's belly, sending him back away out of my view again. The dawn was beginning to rise at this point, and I could see that the Dogman had a similar kind of fur to the pig creatures. It looked sharp and bristly, mainly gray, but with varying darker and lighter shades all growing closely together. His ears were also tall, like the ears of the javelinas, yet the snout was unmistakably canine in nature. It stood on its hind legs, but those legs resembled a dog's back legs. This was not a bear. This was not a Bigfoot. This was some kind of a canine, but a bipedal one. Its eyes seemed to glow in the dark, and there was very little ambient light. Certainly I had no lights on in the van, and as I said, dawn was only beginning to creep into the sky. Yet still, that Dogman had glowing eyes. If you can explain that to me, I'd be eternally grateful. The entire clan of javelinas attacked the Dogman from all angles, some of them leaping and snapping at his hands anytime they moved near enough to the ground. The canine seemed not to care that he was being swarmed. He just dealt with each of the attacks as they came, grabbing peccaries, flinging peccaries, sometimes even tossing them at the giant javelina man to keep him back. He had this calmness matched with lightning speed that reminded me of an old Bruce Lee movie. Inevitably, when enough of the smaller creatures were either worn out or sleeping off the rest of the fight, the two behemoths locked in battle with each other. I saw them, both seemingly exhausted, locking up with each other like two tired boxers in the 14th round. But, unlike boxers, the two kept trying to bite each other's throat open. I never saw such a savage display, and yet both creatures looked ready to pass out. I wondered if they even knew what they were fighting for at that point. I just know they were both desperate to win. The javelina man continually tried to get some distance between them so that he could land blows with his hammer-like hooves, but the Dogman held him in as close as possible, where he could attempt to sink his saber teeth in. The way the fight was going, I began to wonder if they both might win, or both lose, if you know what I mean. I thought about making a break for it while they were distracted with their life and death battle, but there were still too many of the javelinas out there for me to make it very far. Besides, where did I have to run to? At some point, I noticed a dust cloud way off in the distance ahead of me. I prayed that it was not an optical illusion, and also that it was on the same dirt road that I was on. It was quite hard to tell that at first. As the sun began to appear on the horizon, the sound of an approaching car engine drew the attention of the Dogman, and he exited stage right with such speed it seemed impossible. All of his apparent exhaustion disappeared in one big adrenaline rush, and he was gone as fast as he had arrived. The javelinas also seemed to be put off by the approaching vehicle, and they drew together in a bunch, marching off in the opposite direction from the Dogman. I knew I'd better get out of that van so that the approaching driver could see me, so I began working both of the doors up front. They were sealed shut as though the van were made from one single sheet of metal. The driver's side window unrolled, though, so I opened it as wide as it could go and slid myself out, feet first. Once outside, I hailed down the driver, who literally saved my life by picking me up. Not everyone would have. I looked like absolute hell. He could have assumed I was a meth addict and kept on driving. He never mentioned it, but I wonder to this day if he saw those creatures running away. I wonder how much he knew about what I had just been enduring. All I know is that I fell asleep in the passenger seat, and I woke up in a police station. The rest of the story is classified, more or less. So, either there is a giant pig-like cryptid wandering the brushland of New Mexico battling werewolves, or else I had one hell of a heat stroke that night. Maybe one of the cacti I ate for moisture was hallucinogenic, but I don't think so. I swear I will never marry again, or if I do, I'll at least meet the family first. I never want to be near any desert wilderness ever again, even just driving through it. There are so many lessons I learned the hard way during this misadventure. I also have an awful lot of regrets and some extremely painful memories. But the one part of it that I'm glad to have in my memory is the epic fight I got to witness. After all, I might be the only person in history to ever see such a savage Dogman / cryptid battle in New Mexico.
You'll have to put keyboard your mouse to scratch out that desk with more than you. But here's an idea that's lots of fun. Cover your desk with Dogman and Son. Dogman and Son desk mat. Mouse pad for your entire desk. Dogman and Son desk mat. It's rather Kafkaesque.
Order yours today. Link is in the description.
Midwest Dogman Turf War. Dear Scary Stories NYC, first of all, I want to say thank you for the platform you provide for us to allow us to anonymously report our sightings and experiences. Some of us have to cope not only with how horrifying the circumstances were that we lived through, but we also have to keep it all inside. It's not something that we can feel comfortable talking about with most people. It's not something I want attached to my name. Yet, I feel infuriated that I should have to hide the fact that I was present in a location when something happened, just because that something that happened is not officially considered possible. In the case of what happened to me, I'm talking about the Dogman. Or maybe they were werewolves. What does it matter what I call them? Neither is considered real, and nobody's gonna believe me anyhow. This happened in 1999 in Edenville Township, west of Lake Sanford in Michigan. I was hiking around with a friend from college that we can call Jane. I suppose then by default I must be Tarzan. We were just walking through woods and camping when we knew the sun would be going down. There was no rhyme or reason to our vacation. We just chose an area it would be difficult for us to get lost in since we were both from Michigan and both avid nature lovers since a very young age. On top of that, Edenville Township isn't exactly the dark side of the moon. In fact, half the time I think we might have been camping on private property, but I wasn't sure then, and I'm even less sure now. I just know that nearly every day we would happen upon a road or other landmark, and we'd recalculate our location using our compasses and our old paper maps. It felt like we always had a rough idea of where we were, and we really didn't need much more than that, and a supply of food and water. Jane and I were only casual friends back in civilization, but when we would go camping, we had a much closer relationship. Like most guys the age I was back then, I didn't understand it, but I wasn't gonna question it, and I wasn't gonna complain. As long as we went back to being more distant when we got back to the human world, she would get very close to me out in the wild. So, one night we were asleep in our tent, and all hell broke loose outside. Generally, Jane took the lead when there was a mystery, but the sounds coming from outside our tent on that night were not very easy to recognize or categorize. It sounded like hell itself had opened up onto the field we were camped in, and I'm not sure how else to describe or explain it. We were both terrified to look outside, but I could tell by the look on her face that I was going to have to be the one to open the flap and peek out of that tent. And so I did. And when I did, I saw that in fact hell had opened up onto the field outside our tent. I pulled my head back in and announced just that. Jane didn't appreciate me going poetic in that moment. She demanded a detailed description of what was happening. I told her that I saw werewolves battling other werewolves, and creatures that I could not name battling as well. She looked at me as though I were speaking Klingonese. Her annoyance at me grew until it was actually larger and stronger than her fear of whatever was happening outside. She crawled over to the tent flap to peek outside. I know what she saw. I'll tell you exactly what she saw. A battle, or skirmish in some conflict, was happening in that field. There were large, hairy, bipedal creatures racing around outside at speeds as fast as a large cat. These weren't cats, though. They looked more like thin, muscular bears, but they were far faster and more athletic than bears are. They were too wiry to be bears, although most of them seemed every inch as large. While most of those battling would seem to be more or less what you would call a werewolf, there were several variations of kinds, and there were also some that looked so different that I'm not 100% certain that they were dogman or werewolves at all. One creature had a far larger forehead than any of the others. It almost reminded me of gray space aliens. Maybe that's a dogman of the future, come back in a time machine, I don't know. There are also some creatures that in another context I might have viewed as Sasquatch. They were tall and strong-looking, with large human-type feet. When I raised my eyes to their heads, though, they had floppy dog ears and long snouts. Tell me what I'm supposed to call that. Jane and I debated whether it made any sense to stay in that tent in that moment, or if we should try to make a break for it. We both avoided traveling in the woods at night, but we had passed a road that led to a police station shortly before setting up camp. If we were going to make a break for it, we decided that would be the direction to run in. We got our boots on and got prepared to go, even as we continued to debate whether we should sit tight or risk running out into a dogman on dogman military-style conflict. I have to say, when you're in a state of panic, finding something to do can take your mind off of the fact that you might find your life ended at any given moment. We got prepared to go. We got our backpacks packed, and mainly the only thing we wouldn't be bringing with us would be the tent itself. Nervous about going, we both decided to catch our breath and get ready for the run of our lives. Our plan was to carry the backpacks until we reached the woodline, then risk stopping to put them on so that we could move faster from that point. We were giving each other a good luck hug in case that was the last conversation we ever had, and then something large and heavy fell on the tent and both of us, knocking the wind out of us completely. It took a few seconds for the creature who had fallen on us to right itself and allow us to begin to wheeze and gasp for air to get back inside our lungs. We had been bonked pretty hard, but there were no broken bones, and if you've ever had the wind knocked out of you, then you know how painful it can be to try to get the air back inside of yourself after it's exited. We were starting to breathe again, and still recovering from that terrible experience, when something started slicing the tent open from the top on down. It looked like a small dagger at first, but as the opening grew, I saw two glowing eyes looking in at us. That wasn't a dagger. It was a huge claw from one of those Dogman creatures. Jane and I staggered out of the tent to witness chaos all around us. If you ever thought that ridding the world of weaponry would end war, then you should have seen what we saw. It was hand to hand or claw to teeth, maybe. There were passed out dogmen in every direction, with the rest dancing over the prone bodies at lightning speed, battling to the very last man. As we ran toward the part of the woods we needed to get to, it was a broken field run. We had to keep dodging left or running right to avoid creatures attacking each other, or else the unconscious creatures lying all around. I saw so many different variations on the same basic dog-headed human theme that I wondered who was battling who and what the fight was over. Could it be that multiple factions were engaged in this conflict? Could 3 or more different groupings of creatures be fighting over the same turf? I saw more than 4 different kinds of dogmen, so who knows how many armies there were. I saw wolf-headed bipedal dogmen. I saw large wolves that only stood up at certain times while fighting. I saw more than one with a long baboon-like snout but dog ears. I saw 4-legged fast-moving animals with canine bodies and horrific, near-human faces. I mean, they had dog ears. They weren't entirely human, but on the body of a dog, these were disturbing things to see. I guess I should be grateful I only had the moon lighting them. The less detail, the better, in my opinion. As Jane and I entered those woods, it got colder, and it got weirder. By the time we were halfway to our goal of that street that led to the police station, we could hear something loudly pursuing us. It was making a point of destroying as much of the forest as it could as it made its way closer to us. The thing's barks sounded more like screams, and those screams sounded like threats. As the dogman got closer behind us, his cries grew deafeningly loud. They literally hurt my ears, and I was a guy who liked loud concerts at the time. It was absolutely terrifying being pursued in that way. I mean, it was completely unnerving. The worst night of my life, and I once spent a night in a county jail. So we came to the road and almost got hit by a cop car. At least I did. I saw him, but my legs were like lead weights, and I found it too hard to reverse course and get out of his way in time. This forced the cop to swerve and almost get into an accident himself before he was able to stop the police vehicle. Wait, maybe he was a park ranger? Could that be? It's strange that I don't remember his uniform. I do remember he seemed Irish, and when we told him that there was a war between werewolves just a short walk into the woods, he told us that we had been seeing the wee folk and laughed. He started telling all these really bad, corny jokes that I can't remember. Like he said something like, "Do you know why they call them the wee folk?" We did not. Why? Because you only see them after you've had a wee drink. That sort of thing, not taking us seriously at all. We insisted we weren't drunk, and so he asked us to show him where this supposed battle between the dog-headed trolls was taking place. I thought about it. I mean, I did want to show him that we weren't drunk, and that we were telling the truth. But, on the other hand, I was tired, and I wondered if the officer or a ranger or whoever it was could give us a lift to a motel or something like that, which I vaguely remember that he did. So I never went camping again, except in RVs and rented cabins. I only hike during the day now, and I'm inside somewhere when it's dark out. To be honest, most of the sun and exercise I get these days, I get in my local city park. There's never been a report of even one dogman in that park, let alone an entire Midwest Dogman turf war. Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.